Measurable Blood by Erick Mertz, presented by Longbranch Pulp Productions. At 6:06 a.m. on January 31st, 1983, a graveyard operator working the White Hill Police Department's emergency line received the first incoming call of her long shift. The panic caller identified himself as Brian William Donaldson. Donaldson insisted that he be placed in immediate contact with authorities, but only under conditions of strict anonymity. When pressed about the nature of his inquiry, Donaldson gave a single name as his response: Gibson. Detective Randall Parsons was assigned to investigate the man's statement. When offered a variety of standard interview settings, however, Donaldson turned each down, citing an erratic notion of his risk and public exposure. At first, he was only comfortable speaking to Parsons at his home and in the early morning hours. Then he insisted on public places, rattling off a long list before finally settling on the Longbranch Inn, a familiar roadside diner. Reluctantly, Parsons agreed to drive the 6 miles outside of town to meet Donaldson for what he imagined would amount to little more than an interesting cup of coffee. On the morning of February 3rd, Parsons was awoken from a deep sleep by a call on his unlisted home phone. As the detective reached over to pick up the receiver, he made note of the time: 4 a.m. on the dot. His first exhausted thought was that the call came from his ex-wife, the only person other than his father entrusted with that number. Parsons was shocked when he heard Donaldson on the other end, already rambling in mid-sentence as he answered. "What can I do for you?" the detective interrupted. Donaldson remained agitated, voice growing louder as he stuttered and resumed speaking. Eventually, the detective managed to calm him down and determine the purpose of his call. Their 3 o'clock appointment, set for a rear booth in the Longbranch Inn, no longer felt safe enough for Donaldson to keep. "Where would you prefer to meet, then?" Parsons asked, carefully masking his aggravation. Donaldson launched into a detailed description of his vehicle. He said that he drove a 1981 Mercedes station wagon, faded beige, with minor body damage on the rear driver's side panel. He explained to Parsons that at exactly 9:30 that evening, his vehicle would be parked near the Causey Freeway overpass on the westernmost corner of Branwell Road and Northeast 16th Street. "You mean the corner nearest the city park?" Parsons asked. Yes. I take it then that you're familiar with the place." "I am familiar," the weary detective said, head falling back to his pillow. "What exactly would you like me to do with that information, though?" "Meet me," Donaldson answered coolly. "Hold on," Parsons clamored. "Meet you where? Outside? On the corner?" "I will be waiting," the caller replied, with engine running. "You mean meet you in the car?" "Precisely," Donaldson said. "I will be there, prepared to tell you everything that I know." Before Parsons could ask for further details, Donaldson abruptly hung up. The statement of Brian Donaldson.
My Australian shepherd doesn't normally behave in such a way. She is a damn good dog. Well, a champion in her breed. The other night, I don't know exactly what hour it was, but it was getting late. I was already settled down in bed with a book open in my lap when she started acting out. It began innocent enough, I suppose, a few yips at something she heard outside the house. I live off Upper Passmore Road, where prowling critters tend to be the norm. There is an awful lot of wildlife out in that direction. Well, my Aussie starts pacing back and forth. Soon, she was running, going from window to door, barking like mad. She was tracking something. As I climbed out of bed, gut instincts told me that this wasn't just some raccoon. By the time I pulled my boots on, I'm telling you that dog was spooked. Whatever it was had her worked up something fierce. When I couldn't calm her, I suppose that I got spooked too. She doesn't act out like that unless something is wrong. I stepped onto the porch with my flashlight. At first I didn't see or hear anything, just the breeze through the trees, and even that began to still once I was outside the house. My Aussie stood inside the sliding glass door, desperate to pick up what remained of a scent. By the time I surveyed the scene, though, whatever it was or whoever was already long gone. Of course, I didn't really call you out here to talk about anything like that. I called you to talk about Gibson. You want me to tell you what I recall about the time we spent together. Isn't that right? Oh, hell. I suppose that's a far better place to start than with my dog. I always was something of a rational type, even as a kid. Never was much of a churchgoer. I mean, I went with Mom now and then when she felt guilty enough to force my hand. She said a decent family ought to go, as though joining the congregation was an obligation we had to fulfill. Well, Dad went too. Well, at least he made an effort in the very beginning when I was still a small boy. Said that church was the only time of the week that he got to take a nap that had been blessed by the Lord. I always laugh out loud when I think back on him saying that. Made Mom so angry that she'd throw a fit. She never did seem to find anything in all that scripture she pored over that led her to forgive him, either. When all of a sudden Mom died, she had not spoken to my father in quite some time. Going on years, I'd venture to say. By then, he had sort of drifted off, too. But that's just the way some folks go, right? They just drift off of you like when the old east wind blows in and scrubs that settled fog from the valley. I remember what he was like, though, my old man. Not much for talking about his feelings, except for pride. He was open on that topic. He never shied away from saying how proud he was that I chose a solid subject like science and biology on which to apply myself. He nearly burst a button on his vest when he talked about how far I'd taken schooling, further than he ever did or even could. One day, I was outside raking leaves when the old man stepped onto the porch and shouted, "You got brains, son. Now get out there and use 'em." I suppose, when I look back on it, that is precisely what I went and did. Oh, there were some good old days, boy, I'm telling you. I remember sitting up in the president's office at the university with Gibson. It was a cold, windy day, kind of like this one here. The school president sure was hot under the collar, though. He rattled about how the two of us had been hired as a team, and we were going to bring the biology department up to become one of the premier scientific research schools in the country. No, that isn't right. He said the world. He said to us, "Together you two boys are going to bring the world to our damn doorstep." Well, I was so green then. Wasn't even aware what it meant to be a part of something bigger, a team. Don't know if you can tell that I was a loner. Still am, really. I was always better off on my own. Most important for you to understand, I was just a boy. We made for a damn good match, though. Right away, I liked Gibson. From the moment we shook hands out in the lobby, we were like two peas in a pod. Well, at least it seemed as much. Oh, Gibson. Funny thing, but I only knew the man as Gibson. Same as now. Don't know whether it was his first name or what it was last, and I don't suppose it much matters either. Didn't then, and it certainly doesn't now. We walked into that office, two men, and we walked out a team. Damn! Gibson could have been my brother. perhaps even my twin. People say those kinds of things, and I never quite knew what it meant. But when we started working together, it became quite clear. We were a pair of dyed-in-the-wool rationalists, right down to the last drop of our measurable blood. In the laboratory, we followed the same ideas. We even completed one another's sentences. You ever have that happen with another person? Well, if you have not had that privilege, let me tell you something. It can be a life-altering kind of experience. Yeah, that's what it is. I won't deny that it makes the heart begin to race. You thought your life had meaning. Then you suddenly wake up one morning filled with your genuine purpose. Like I was trying to say, those were some good old days, and not just something that you bandy about at some faculty luncheon just to pass away the time. Every single moment between Gibson and I was brimming with limitless possibility. In the laboratory, our research progressed at a staggering rate. I don't want to bore you with the droll specifics, but Gibson and I were breaking new ground. Every trial, it seemed, we carved out some undiscovered niche. We were putting our names out for the whole world to see. And I knew people were getting ahead of themselves when they said it, but we started to hear rumblings. Nobel Prize. Yeah, it was just our peers at the university, but that's heady praise. What we chose to do outside of our work, in our free time, well, I saw that as our personal business. Gibson and I rubbed elbows at a few of the bigger faculty functions. We had lunch. Sometimes we walked down through the campus to get some air, although I don't know that Gibson really needed to take a break. Didn't know much about him, present or past. As I said, I'm something of a loner, too. Not many friends, just a few peers. Instinct told me, though, that he was a native to the area. But hell, I don't know for sure. Didn't seem to matter. I was an ambitious man, understand? Ambition can turn even the smartest among us absolutely blind. Well, it would be wrong to envision Gibson as a quiet man. He talked quite a lot about his theories, actually. He would stop in the middle of his work, pull back those goggles, and throw out an idea, something he either read in a journal or was testing on the side at home. Not much more than that. We worked together for 2 years before he even brought up the word mimicry. I told him what I thought right off, which wasn't much at the time. I turned back toward him, pulled off my gloves, and asked, "You mean like that viceroy butterfly that looks and behaves exactly like a monarch?" Gibson smiled. "Yeah," he replied, "just like that." I remember his face when he said those words. It's burned into my brain as though this happened yesterday. He had gone absolutely pale, sallow cheeks sunken further back as a sly grin crept in at the corners of his mouth. "Yeah, just like that." Gibson was the smartest man I had ever met up to that point. Hell, even since. I see that you've compiled a dossier on me over there. You probably know that I like to read science journals. If you haven't already, go and check out my library records. Go ahead. I don't care. I read them all. They tend to relax me. Gibson, though? What's the right word? He absorbed the literature of our trade. I would watch him. Newspapers, magazines, the densest books you'd ever seen. He would devour them, only to return months later with a perfect recollection. Gibson could flip through thousands of pages of raw, uncategorized data and know it. Not just familiarized. Understand my meaning here? He would know that material cold, chapter and verse. At the time, I was quite impressed. Well, I ask you, who wouldn't be? I knew some really smart people in my time, but Gibson had rare powers. Sometimes all I could do was shake my head in disbelief. I always had the gut feeling that the man I worked side by side with was touched by something special. To see his power of recall, though, sometimes I don't know. Sometimes getting a glimpse of how his mind worked was just plain spooky. Oh, how was it spooky? Well, I didn't quite add it up at the time, but soon after I started wondering about a man who commits so much of himself one way. As I have said, though, and you're probably tired of hearing me say as much, I wasn't quite thinking of things. Well, not then, at least. Those were the good old days. Well, Gibson started talking about mimicry quite a bit. I don't know precisely when I noticed that the topic had taken over our conversations, but it sure wasn't long after our first coming up. As I understood it, he had come around to the belief that mimicry explained our evolution. The way Gibson talked, it seemed like he believed that mimicry was leading us, I don't know, somewhere. To him, it was the one idea that served to open all the rest. Well, he didn't exactly thrust his idea of mimicry into the midst of the work we were paid for. He was so very careful about letting that slip. This was an every night prospect, something for when he finally got home from work. Well, perhaps it occupied his mind in the mornings on his walks down to the lab. I don't know, though. He never said where it came from. At the time, though, when I pictured Gibson, I could see him grooming his master idea out of those quiet moments. Well, I suppose you have a partner, maybe you did. Well, then you can appreciate this. When you work side by side with a man for that long, you get to recognize the simmering of ideas, good and bad. You know when he's happy. You recognize when he and the wife have reached that bitter end. Well, maybe it's a change of the breath or their complexion. Came a point for me when I recognized that this idea of mimicry was on Gibson's damn mind all the time. I realized something else. It wasn't just butterflies. He was past the conundrum of monarchs and viceroys. He was onto far grander notions. Gibson was touching on ideas about our collective origins. I mean, he was pushing back, far back, all the way to that primordial ooze from which we dragged our first heathen forms. When I first heard the news, it sounded like a rumor, a word passed around between members of the faculty, the way someone makes up an idle observation and then that's relayed as fact. Didn't take very long for this to grow into something more than a rumor, though. I don't like to speculate. Doesn't seem fair to cast theories on a subject so closely aligned with a man's integrity. Well, after all, that's his core. Gibson and I were so close, though. As those whispers became louder, I had to start adding them up for myself. Perhaps it was for the sake of my own sanity. Turns out, all of Gibson's papers and reports, everything that came from his prodigious research, was faked. Gibson would dig into areas that other researchers missed before carefully filling in the blanks, or more accurately, he would interject what he thought those conclusions ought to have been. All of those theories he had mastered, every one of them elaborate frauds that he had carefully built using only his imagination, and that amazing memory. Was it because he was pushing that idea of mimicry? I can only guess that yes. He was so deep into that amorphous pool that when the time came, he could not extract himself. Never had a chance to come down to that, though. Our inquiry lacked all the subtlety of a reason why. No one seemed to care. They wanted justice. Well, you might imagine that as soon as Gibson's research started to bounce back, it placed a black mark on the school's reputation. His supposed fraud, well, it threatened to destroy everything the president sought to build. His notion of a top-shelf institution teetered on the crux of questionable credibility. It wasn't just the biology department. No, this kind of idea, the lack of institutional control implied, spreads like a goddamn prairie fire. And the president wasn't going to allow that to happen. The way he saw it, everyone was teetering on the same brink. He called together a panel the afternoon the newspaper got wind. "Review his work," the president barked in his hand-picked members. "Whatever you find, remember, we must scuttle this man, fast." I mean, his fury was beyond anything I'd seen before, and rightfully so. The president had trusted Gibson. He had trusted us. He threatened his panel in the process, too. He told us, as he paced before that big window behind his desk, that our careers would be forfeit unless we did the right thing. The right thing. I laugh to think of that idea. There were 8 of us in that room tasked with making the decision, and we all received his message. We met in private for only a few days. In truth, it really doesn't take all that long when you have the kind of evidence we did. Believe me when I say that what I contributed to was an inquisition. There really is no exaggeration there. There was a bitter sense of vengeance in those panel members. There was fear, but it was not the fear of any one man. That came much, much later. Ours was a fear of loss of comfort. I mean, we had to crucify him, or we would be reduced to looking for new jobs. Going out on the limb for some notion of justice, detective? Care to raise a hand for the man when it is your pension on the block? Tenure and position mean everything to those kinds of people. And me? Yeah, I too had become that kind of person who looks at his bottom line first. Then comes a thought about what might be right. Was there greater justice deserved? Oh, hell, I don't really know. I just don't anymore. When we walked out of that room, though, with our decision in hand, I didn't feel good, even if I could see that those rumors of fraud were true. Here is what I do know. Not everything that is right feels good in the end. Everyone at the time came to me for answers, but I didn't have anything. We were partners, not friends. I didn't like talking about the situation. Everything felt like rank speculation. What I trained myself to say, though, whenever people asked, was that somewhere along the line, Gibson had disassociated from reality. Well, and here is some healthy speculation, though. What I'm about to give you is a view I don't often express. There are moments, rare glimpses, when I actually believe that we may have somehow freed him. Gibson vanished, shut out, locks changed. In truth, he was already gone, long before the whole sordid chapter began. Of course, he was betrayed rather unfairly, People were saying all manner of derogatory things about him, as though academic fraud opened up his character for a wholesale rebuke. The more diplomatic of our peers speculated that he was hunkered down, focusing on some pet project to prove us all wrong. Perhaps this was the time to work on all of those mimicry nonsense ideas. Others said that he left town altogether for a quiet place where no one would know him, somewhere he could just forget things. Well, no one really knew, not for sure. There came a point when people stopped asking me what I believed happened to him. They even stopped looking at me funny. I did hear those whispers, though. Where was the peer review for this work? Why wasn't I looking after his best interests? There was a very brief period when all of that finally went away, and I could almost forget that this terrible madness had even taken place. I was assigned a new research partner. He was a nice guy and a decent scientist. He was adept at figuring out how to tie up loose ends. We picked up, finishing what we could. Together we set about the task of repairing the damage already done to our department. Yeah, there was a brief time when walking into the lab, I felt almost normal. Had anyone flat out asked me, though, I would have said without hesitation that Gibson was still around. He didn't go anywhere. I could almost, feel him around every corner. Besides, it didn't seem in his character to run. By the time we destroyed him, everything that we took away had lost its meaning. In Gibson's mind, he was working towards something far more important than pension or tenure. He required space, just enough to cultivate these theories. When a person who is a part of you is then suddenly torn away, the natural response is to mourn him with wonder. One just naturally fills in the gaps. You wouldn't be human otherwise. No, Gibson was around. I knew as much from the very start. A few times I offered this theory, leaking my idea that he was still in town. Folks would scoff. They blew me off. Or else those who knew how close we were would turn away in fear. By then, everyone had developed one compelling idea or another. Believe me, though, I could feel his presence. Then the calls started coming. I don't know exactly when the panic started going around. Perhaps it was in the wintertime. Just when it seemed the old rumors had died out, a new one started. Gibson was calling on panel members, interrupting them at odd hours, dropping in unannounced. Well, some people, and you've probably heard this and know far more than me, found evidence that he had, been inside of their homes. Well, nothing would be missing or disturbed, you understand? Just evidence. They would walk back into their empty house and know that he had been there. Door slightly ajar, one wet footprint, or nothing. You grasp this? You really understand? These are intelligent, reasonably well thought out people, scientists, doctors. Suddenly they are all thrust into a panic over what? A goddamn cold feeling? I first heard about this from one of my colleagues, a guy by the name of Heston. Good man, sane man too. Maybe he drank a little much, but let's say he was reasonable. One morning, Heston tells me that he saw Gibson down at the bottom of his driveway as he was pulling out for work. He knew who it was. There he was, minding his own business, walking in circles around the cul-de-sac. Heston didn't think too much at first. His was a busy neighborhood, and there was this trail leading up from the forest. Figured that Gibson had been out for a hike and come upon the asphalt turnaround that bisects the trail. Anyway, Heston pulls up, opens his window, and leans out to say hello. Well, Gibson just smiles. before he turns to stagger back towards the woods. Not a word, just a knowing smile, and then he's gone. I'd seen it before, that smile. Made me uneasy to hear someone else describe it so accurately, too. It was that same smile that he wore when talking about monarchs and viceroys. Anyway, I'm off track. Heston didn't know what to make of the encounter. Continued on to work like usual, but he could not get that image of Gibson's smile out of his mind. It was just, as he put it, there. Well, I don't know if you believe in coincidences, but this was also the day that the power went out in the biology building. The whole rest of the school was fine except for the biology department, which went dark. Talk about a madhouse. People went crazy salvaging their products. Never seen such a state of mannered panic in all my life. Heston decided to go home early. Said he had a nice bottle of single malt calling out his name. He drove down the hill through that cul-de-sac and then up his driveway. I've been to the man's house. Beautiful plot. He has a really nice view. He's surrounded by old-growth timber. Said he parked, picked up his mail, and walked through the front door where he went as cold as icicles. Dropped his mail and his bag onto the hardwood floor and then jumped at the sound of that. He's been here, Heston thought. He's been in my house. Then he proceeds to search every square inch, only he finds nothing. You heard me? Nothing. There was not a single sign that Gibson had been there. You understand that? Every door and every window was locked, same as he had left it before. All that Heston possessed was some goddamn cold feeling. His voice trembled that next morning as he pulled me aside in the cafeteria. When I asked him what was wrong, Heston said that Gibson's smile was haunting him. No matter what he did, he could not shake that eerie, calm smile from his mind. Now I urged Heston to avoid hysteria. Be rational, I said. Think about what you're saying. Well, I couldn't exactly stop him. No one could. Man had become unhinged like a screen door in a storm. Started sharing an embellished version of his story with the rest of the faculty, making sure the other panel members knew what he had experienced. Well, of course, he spooked them all out of their wits. Then these other stories started flying around. People were seeing Gibson in their windows in the grocery store, standing stone still in the crosswalk late at night. People I know, these educated, rational people, were having restraining orders pulled left and right, citing the risk of imminent harm. Well, there was no direct contact, only a hunch at what his appearance might mean. Well, suggestion has a powerful effect on some people. Ultimately, I have come to believe that it is more powerful than anything you can empirically prove. Very few, if any of those folks, got their restraining orders, and those who did never got a chance to use them. Even if they encountered Gibson, it was merely in passing. He never stuck around long enough to get himself arrested. No, Gibson would just drift into their lives long enough to suggest, then he would be gone, leaving that unfortunate soul with the difficult task of making sense of it all. Come and go. That is all he ever did. My colleagues say he's furious about the Inquisition. He's ready to grieve the losses of property in his scientific career. I know that isn't the truth, though. It's too neat and far too simple. All of this activity circles back to his theory, see? Somehow this has to do with mimicry. As awful as what we did to him felt to all of us, for him, it amounted to a simple obstacle on the path to digging up some greater truth about who and what we are. The panel? Well, latent guilt, I suppose. Maybe I'm last on this so-called list he's working through. Hell, maybe I was first and I just didn't pick up on it. I don't know. I doubt this, though, seriously. Always has been my way to avoid dwelling on something I cannot prove. I have yet to feel him that close to me. Not just yet. Well, I suppose, now, this brings us back to my Australian shepherd. After she tracked around the house as I described, growling and barking, I went outside, brought my flashlight, and I grabbed my rifle from the mantel. Well, I forgot to mention that. Stood out on the back porch listening for what had her spooked. Everything was so quiet. I couldn't see anything either. A fog bank had rolled in over the meadow, so dense you could hardly see 6 or 8 feet in front of you. I looked over the railing and couldn't even see the ground. Stood on the porch for a long moment, looking and listening. When I went back inside to grab the dog and show her that nothing was wrong, she just wouldn't go. Sat there on the threshold, all those wails and barks reduced to cries and whimpers. Her claws dug into the carpet. Nothing that I could do would persuade her to come out with me. Finally, I just let her go, and she scurried away from the door, tail between her legs. That dog hid beneath the kitchen table the rest of the night. She has never done that before. Understand? My dog was only half the reason I called you the other day, Detective. The rest? Well, I reach back to close that sliding door, and this breeze comes up my back, the likes of which has no place on a foggy night. Heard the chimes twinkle around the front of the house, and this cold feeling set over me, like no other I'd ever felt before. Not in my whole life. That feeling, it was him. It was Gibson. He had been there, or he was there. I don't quite know. I don't. Not yet. Here's the spooky part, though. It was him, but it also wasn't him at all. I recognized this even before the chill coursed its way through my body. Remember what I told you about? Remember about the butterflies, how one assumes the mask of the other out of a need for protection? Well, I don't know. Now, I'm somehow onto this idea, too. When you think about it, though, it starts to make some sense. That isn't the point, though, right? The point is, Detective, I'm scared. That cold feeling from the porch has not gone out of my flesh. You got to know that. You got to understand that Gibson is working down some list. That much is certain. And now he's come for me.
The Measurable Blood audiobook was performed by Donald Wright and Erick Mertz. Recording services were provided by Union Sound in Damascus, Oregon. Production by Erick Mertz. Music provided by Stephen Perkins.